When a powerful CEO makes a desperate Christmas Eve proposal to his quiet assistant, offering her life-changing money to pose as his wife for just 3 days. Neither of them expects the heart-stopping condition that will threaten to destroy everything. What begins as a simple business arrangement becomes a dangerous dance of forbidden feelings, family secrets, and a love that was never supposed to happen. Before we begin, if you love heartfelt romance stories like this one, please subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new tale. Now, let's dive into our story. The office tower stood like a lonely sentinel against the darkening Christmas Eve sky, its windows flickering with the last remnants of holiday cheer. On the 42nd floor, Natalie Brooks squinted at her computer screen, her fingers dancing across the keyboard as she reconciled the final quarterly reports. Around her, the cubicles sat empty and silent, abandoned hours ago by colleagues eager to begin their celebrations. Natalie didn't mind the solitude. The quiet gave her space to breathe, to think, to avoid the painful reminder that she had nowhere urgent to be. Her studio apartment awaited with its single strand of lights and frozen dinner. But first, she needed to finish these reports. Her father's experimental cancer treatment wasn't going to pay for itself. And every extra hour she logged meant another small deposit into the medical fund that never seemed to grow fast enough. At 26, Natalie had learned to measure her life in practical terms. Dreams were luxuries she couldn't afford. Romance was a distraction she didn't have time for. She had responsibilities, crushing debt, and a father whose life depended on her ability to keep working, keep saving, keep pushing forward no matter how exhausted she became. The sudden sound of footsteps on the polished marble floor made her freeze mid-keystroke. She knew those footsteps. Everyone in the office knew those footsteps. Confident, measured, purposeful. They belonged to Jonathan West, the youngest CEO in the company's 70-year history. A man whose mere presence could silence an entire boardroom and whose rare smiles could make stock prices jump. Natalie had worked as a junior accountant in his company for 18 months. And in all that time, she had maybe spoken directly to him 3 times. He existed in a different stratosphere, moving through the office like some untouchable force of nature, brilliant and intimidating. She was invisible to him, just another nameless face in the sea of employees who kept his empire running smoothly. But tonight, those purposeful footsteps stopped directly beside her desk. She looked up slowly, her heart suddenly hammering for reasons she couldn't explain. Jonathan West stood before her, and something was profoundly, disturbingly wrong. His usually immaculate appearance was disheveled in a way that seemed almost sacrilegious. His charcoal suit jacket was gone, his tie hung loose around his neck like a noose he tried to escape. The top 2 buttons of his crisp white shirt were undone. His dark hair, normally perfectly styled with that effortless elegance that came from expensive barbers, looked as though he had run his hands through it 100 times in frustration. But it was his eyes that truly caught her attention and held it captive. Those sharp, calculating brown eyes that could dissect a business proposal in seconds, that could spot a single error in a 100-page report, that could make grown men squirm with a single glance, now held something she had never seen before. Something that made her breath catch in her throat. Pure, unfiltered desperation. "Miss Brooks," he said, and even his voice was different. The usual commanding edge was gone, replaced by something rough and raw. "I need to speak with you." "It's urgent." Natalie blinked, certain she had somehow misheard. "I'm sorry, Mr. West. Did you need something from the accounting department? I can pull any reports you require, or if there's an error in the quarterly statements, I can—" "No," he interrupted sharply, then seemed to catch himself. He took a breath, visibly struggling for composure. He glanced around the empty office floor, the rows of dark cubicles, the abandoned coffee cups and silent computers. "Can we speak in my office? Please." That single word "please" spoken by Jonathan West to a junior accountant was so unprecedented, so shocking, that Natalie felt her world tilt slightly on its axis. She saved her work with fingers that had started to tremble and stood on unsteady legs. She followed him through the maze of cubicles, past the dark conference rooms and silent break area, to the executive suite at the far end of the building. Each step felt surreal. Like walking through a dream where the normal rules of reality no longer applied, his office was everything she had imagined during those rare moments when she let herself wonder about his world. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the city draped in Christmas lights, the streets below glittering like rivers of gold and silver. The furniture was all clean lines and minimalist elegance, each piece probably costing more than she made in 6 months. A massive desk of polished teak dominated one side of the room, its surface immaculate except for a single closed laptop. The walls held tasteful abstract art that Natalie suspected was original and worth more than her life savings. But tonight, the beauty of this space was overshadowed by an oppressive silence that seemed to amplify every breath, every heartbeat. Jonathan didn't sit behind his imposing desk in that leather chair that looked more like a throne. Instead, he moved to the windows, pressing one hand against the cold glass, staring out at the city as if searching for answers in the twinkling lights below. His shoulders were tense beneath his expensive shirt, his entire body radiating attention so profound that Natalie could feel it from across the room. The silence stretched and stretched, growing heavier with each passing second until Natalie began to wonder if he had somehow forgotten she was there. "If this was all some bizarre mistake, I'm going to ask you something," he finally said, his voice so low she had to strain to hear it. "Something I have absolutely no right to ask. Something that violates every professional boundary that should exist between us." He paused, and she watched his reflection in the dark glass as he closed his eyes briefly. "Something that makes me question my own sanity for even considering it." Natalie's mouth went completely dry. Her mind raced through 1,000 scenarios, each more bizarre than the last, none of them making any sense. He turned from the window then, and the raw vulnerability in his expression, this man who was always so controlled, so composed, made her take an involuntary step backward. The CEO was gone. The brilliant businessman had vanished. In his place stood someone broken and desperate and utterly human. "I need you to pretend to be my wife," he said, the words tumbling out in a rush as if he feared losing his nerve. "For 3 days, starting tomorrow morning, Christmas Day through the day after. I need you to come to my family's estate, play the role of my loving spouse, and help me survive what will otherwise be the worst Christmas of my life." The words hung in the air between them, so absurd and impossible that for a long moment, Natalie's brain simply refused to process them. She stared at him, convinced she had somehow fallen asleep at her desk and was now experiencing the world's strangest work-related stress dream. "I'm sorry," she finally managed, her voice coming out as barely a whisper. "What did you just say?" Jonathan closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, he looked older, somehow worn down by invisible weights that had been crushing him for far too long. He moved closer, no longer hiding behind the distance, and she could see every line of strain around his mouth, every shadow of exhaustion beneath his eyes. "My family," he began, each word seeming to cost him something precious. "They're not like normal families. They don't gather for Christmas to exchange gifts and share love and create warm memories. For them, Christmas is a tribunal, an annual performance review of my life, a systematic examination of every way I've failed to meet their impossible expectations." He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair, a gesture of frustration that made him look younger, more vulnerable. "Every year, it's the same interrogation. Why am I not married yet? Why am I not providing them with grandchildren and heirs? Why do I insist on disappointing them with my selfish bachelor lifestyle? Why can't I be more like my brother Cameron, who did everything right, who married the perfect woman and produced the perfect children and became the perfect West family son?" There was bitterness in his voice now, old wounds reopening. 2 months ago, during what was supposed to be a simple phone call about holiday arrangements, my mother pushed me too far. She started her usual lecture about my responsibilities, my duties, the family legacy. I was tired. I was frustrated. And I lied. He looked directly at Natalie, his gaze intense and pleading. "I told her I was married. I said I'd been seeing someone seriously and we'd eloped a month earlier. It was a desperate lie meant to buy me some peace, some breathing room. I thought I'd have time to figure out an excuse, to come up with some reason why she couldn't meet this fictional wife. He pulled his phone from his pocket with shaking hands and held it up. She called me this morning. She's planned a massive family gathering. Extended relatives, family friends, business associates, everyone. And she expects me to arrive tomorrow with my wife. Show up alone. If they discover I lied about something this significant, the consequences will be, he stopped, his jaw clenching hard enough that she could see the muscle jump. I'll never hear the end of it. They'll use it as proof that I'm unstable, unreliable, unfit to lead the company my grandfather built. My mother will make my life a living hell, and my father will question every business decision I make. Natalie's mind reeled, trying to process this flood of information, trying to understand why he was telling her all this. Mr. West, I still don't understand why you're telling me this, or why you would think I could possibly, because you're perfect. He interrupted, and the intensity in his voice made her breath catch. In 18 months, I've watched you work. You're professional, discreet, competent. You don't engage in office gossip. You don't play political games. You keep your head down and do exceptional work. You're exactly the kind of person I can trust with something this sensitive, this important. The compliment should have felt good, but instead, it stung. She was perfect because she was invisible, forgettable, safe. The answer is no, Natalie said firmly, finding her voice and her spine. She turned toward the door, her cheeks burning with a mixture of embarrassment and indignation. I'm sorry you're in this situation, Mr. West, but I can't be part of whatever bizarre family drama you have going on. This is completely inappropriate, and I think I should leave before $180,000. Natalie's hand froze on the door handle. The number echoed in her mind, bouncing around her skull like a pinball. She turned slowly, certain she had misheard. Certain her desperate, exhausted brain had conjured that number from thin air. Jonathan stood in the center of his office, his hands now clenched at his sides, his entire body vibrating with tension. I will wire $180,000 to your account. Half immediately, half when we return. For 3 days of your time. You'll stay at my family's estate, play the role of my loving wife, and then return to your normal life. It's a simple business transaction. Clean, professional, mutually beneficial. The number wasn't random. It couldn't be random. It was too specific, too precise, too impossibly perfect. $180,000 was the exact amount to the penny that she needed to cover her father's experimental treatment, the cutting-edge therapy that the insurance company had denied. The last hope they had left after 2 years of watching him fade. How did you know? She whispered, her voice breaking on the words. Her legs felt weak, and she leaned against the door for support. How did you know that exact number? For the first time since this surreal conversation began, something like shame crossed Jonathan's features. He looked away, unable to meet her eyes. I make it my business to know things about key employees, he said quietly. When I was considering who to approach with this proposal, I did my research. I reviewed personnel files. I saw the medical hardship withdrawal requests, the denied loan applications, the financial strain in your credit report. I'm not proud of invading your privacy this way, but I needed to know I was offering something that would matter enough for you to say yes. Something that would make this impossible request possible. It was manipulative, calculated, a perfect demonstration of exactly why Jonathan West was so successful in business. He identified needs and exploited them with surgical precision. And yet $180,000 was her father's life. It was the difference between watching him waste away and giving him a fighting chance. It was every sleepless night, every skipped meal, every impossible choice between his medication and her rent. It was hope, tangible and real, offered by a desperate man who needed something only she could provide. There has to be more to it. Natalie said, fighting to keep her voice steady even as her world tilted and spun. People don't offer that kind of money without strings attached. What's the real catch? What are you not telling me? Jonathan's expression hardened, the vulnerable man disappearing behind the CEO's mask once again. He moved to his desk with purposeful strides and retrieved a tablet from the top drawer. Its screen glowed to life, illuminating his face with cold blue light as he pulled up a document, pages and pages of dense legal text. "The catch is this," he said, turning the tablet toward her so she could see the words contract and confidentiality agreement in bold letters at the top. "We sign a legally binding contract. A comprehensive agreement with one absolutely non-negotiable rule that supersedes everything else." He paused, and Natalie saw something flicker in his eyes. Fear, maybe. Or perhaps warning. Under no circumstances are we to develop genuine romantic feelings for one another, he continued, his voice taking on the cold, clinical tone she recognized from company-wide meetings. "This is a performance, a business transaction. Nothing more, nothing less. If either of us begins to feel any form of authentic emotional attachment to anything beyond professional courtesy, we are contractually obligated to confess immediately. The moment that confession occurs, the agreement terminates instantly, and you forfeit half the payment." The words landed like physical blows. This wasn't just about fooling his family. This was about protecting himself, building walls so high that not even accidentally catching feelings could breach them. "And there's one more condition," Jonathan added, his voice dropping even lower. "To ensure there are no complications or awkwardness after our arrangement ends, your position here will be transferred. I've already secured a comparable role for you at our Chicago branch office. Same responsibilities, better pay, improved benefits package. It's technically a promotion, a clean break for both of us, a clean break. Corporate speak for you'll be disposed of the moment you're no longer useful." Another way of saying she would be erased from his world as thoroughly as if she had never existed. Natalie had spent her entire childhood being passed between distant relatives and temporary foster homes, always temporary, always disposable, always the girl who was just passing through. This offer was just another version of the same painful story, but $180,000 was her father's life. It was the only thing that mattered. "I want to see the full contract first," Natalie heard herself say, her voice sounding distant and strange to her own ears. "And I want 60% of the money wired to my account before we leave tomorrow, not half. If I'm taking this risk, I need insurance." Something that might have been respect flickered across Jonathan's face. "Agreed," he said without hesitation. He handed her the tablet. "Read it carefully. Take your time. This is legally binding, and I need you to understand exactly what you're agreeing to." Natalie took the device with trembling hands and began reading. The contract was thorough to the point of being frightening. It outlined every detail, their cover story, expected behavior, confidentiality clauses, the payment schedule, the transfer terms, and that one rule, repeated and emphasized in bold text throughout the document like a curse. "No romantic attachment permitted." At the bottom was a digital signature line. Waiting for her to commit. Her hands shook so badly she almost dropped the tablet. This was insane, reckless, possibly the worst decision she would ever make. But when she closed her eyes, she saw her father's face, gaunt and pale. Saw the hope in his eyes when she had promised him they would find a way. Heard his voice telling her not to worry, that he had lived a good life, that she had already done enough. "I accept," she whispered, opening her eyes. "I'll do it." The relief that washed over Jonathan's features was so profound it was almost painful to witness. His shoulders sagged, his hands unclenched, and for just a moment, he looked like a man who had been granted a stay of execution. "Thank you," he breathed, and the genuine gratitude in his voice was almost worse than the manipulation had been. "You have no idea what this means to me." Natalie pressed her finger to the screen, watching her digital signature appear on the contract. The word "accepted" glowed in green letters, sealing her fate. The tablet chimed softly, confirming the agreement was now legally binding. Jonathan moved with sudden purpose, pulling open another drawer in his desk. He withdrew a small velvet box, and Natalie's breath caught as he opened it to reveal a ring that stole what little air remained in her lungs. It wasn't ostentatious, or massive, or designed to scream wealth. It was perfect in its simplicity, a platinum band with a single round diamond that caught the office lights and threw tiny rainbows across the walls like trapped stars. It was elegant and timeless and beautiful, and it made her chest ache for reasons she couldn't begin to name. "We need our story straight," Jonathan said, shifting seamlessly into planning mode, his voice regaining some of its usual command. "We met at the company's annual charity gala 8 months ago. You were there as part of the volunteer committee. I gave a speech about corporate responsibility. We started talking during the reception, and the connection was immediate, undeniable. We kept our relationship private because I value clear boundaries between personal and professional life, and we didn't want office gossip to complicate things." He took her left hand, and the touch sent an unexpected jolt of electricity racing up her arm. His fingers were cool and steady against her skin, a stark contrast to her own trembling last month during a weekend trip to Vermont. "I proposed at sunset from our cabin's balcony," he continued, his voice softer now, almost tender, as if he were describing something real. No elaborate production, no grand gesture, just two people who knew they wanted to spend their lives together. "We got married at a small courthouse ceremony with just 2 witnesses because we value our privacy and wanted something intimate and meaningful." He slid the ring onto her finger with agonizing slowness. The cool metal whispered against her skin, settling at the base of her finger with a weight that felt both foreign and strangely profound, a symbol of a lie that somehow felt more real than anything else in her carefully controlled life. "Welcome to the West family, Mrs. West," Jonathan said formally. But when he raised his head, his eyes met hers, and for a fraction of a second, she saw something flicker in their depths. Something that looked like vulnerability, like loneliness, like the ghost of a question he was afraid to ask. Then it was gone, replaced by the mask of the CEO. And he released her hand. "Be ready at 7 tomorrow morning," he said, all business once again. "Dress comfortably but elegantly. We'll be there through the day after Christmas. Pack accordingly." Natalie nodded, not trusting her voice. She looked down at the ring on her finger, watching it catch the light, and felt the weight of what she had just agreed to settle over her like a shroud. She had just sold 3 days of her life and potentially her heart for the price of her father's survival. As she left his office and rode the elevator down to the empty lobby, she pulled out her phone with shaking hands. Her banking app showed a pending deposit, $108,000. More money than she had ever seen in her life, appearing like magic, like a miracle, like a deal with the devil. She transferred every penny to the medical center's payment portal, watching her father's treatment balance drop to a manageable number. Tears streamed down her face as she walked through the snowy streets toward home, the ring on her finger feeling heavier with each step. Her phone buzzed with a call from her father. She answered, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Natalie. Sweetheart, the hospital just called. They said the payment came through. They can start my treatment next week." "How did you? Where did you? It's a Christmas bonus." She lied, the words tasting like ass. "A big one. Everything's going to be okay now, Dad. I promise." His sob of relief on the other end of the line broke her heart and fortified her resolve in equal measure. She had made the right choice. She had to believe that. Even as the ring on her finger seemed to burn with the heat of the lie she would have to live for the next 3 days, even as a small, terrifying voice in the back of her mind whispered that 3 days might be long enough to break every rule in Jonathan West's carefully constructed contract. The drive to the West estate began in a silence so thick it felt like a living thing pressed between them. Jonathan's luxury sedan glided through the snowy Christmas morning streets with barely a whisper of sound. The world outside transformed into a winter wonderland that mocked the tension inside the car. Natalie sat rigid in the passenger seat, her hands folded in her lap, acutely aware of the unfamiliar weight of the ring on her finger. Watching the city give way to sprawling countryside estates that spoke of old money and older secrets, she hadn't slept more than an hour. After leaving Jonathan's office, she had spent the night packing and repacking her small suitcase, trying on every outfit she owned and finding them all inadequate for a world she didn't belong to. She had practiced her story in the mirror until the words felt hollow and mechanical. She had stared at the ring until her eyes burned, wondering what she had gotten herself into now. Sitting beside the man who had bought 3 days of her life, Natalie felt the full crushing weight of her decision. She glanced at Jonathan from the corner of her eye. His jaw was set like stone, his hands gripping the steering wheel with unnecessary force. He looked like a man driving toward his own execution. And she supposed, in a way, he was. "Tell me more about your family," Natalie said quietly, breaking the oppressive silence. "If I'm going to convince them I'm your wife, I need to know what I'm walking into. You gave me the basics last night, but I need details. What are they really like?" Jonathan's knuckles whitened on the wheel. He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. But then he began to speak, his voice flat and careful, as if he were delivering a business report rather than describing his own family. "My father, Richard West, built his fortune in commercial real estate development. He's brilliant, ruthless, and views every relationship as a transaction with measurable returns on investment. He doesn't understand emotions because he's never believed in their value. He'll assess you the way he assesses a property looking for flaws, calculating your worth, determining if you're an asset or a liability." He paused at a red light, and the silence of the car amplified his next words. "My mother, Victoria, was a debutante from an old money family. She married my father because it was the socially appropriate match. She treats life like an elaborate stage production where she's always the star, and everyone else exists to support her performance. She measures success in appearances, in what people think, in maintaining the perfect image. She smiles at you while dissecting every word you say, every gesture you make, looking for proof that you're not good enough for her son." The light changed, and they moved forward through streets that grew progressively more affluent. The houses larger, the gates more imposing. "My older brother, Cameron, is complicated," Jonathan continued, his voice taking on a harder edge. "He was supposed to be the golden child. He did everything right, married the right woman, had the right children, pursued the right career. But his tech startup failed spectacularly 5 years ago, and he's never recovered from that shame. He resents me for succeeding where he failed. He'll be polite to your face, but his questions will have barbs hidden in them, designed to make you stumble. And your sister." Natalie prompted. "Olivia," Jonathan said, and something that might have been affection flickered across his face before disappearing. "She's the youngest, and in many ways, the smartest of all of us. She learned early that in our family, information is currency. She watches, she listens, she remembers everything. She collects secrets the way other people collect art. She be the most dangerous one because she be looking for the cracks in our story, the places where the truth shows through." He turned through a set of massive iron gates adorned with elaborate wreaths that probably cost more than Natalie's monthly rent. "There's one more thing you need to know," he said quietly. "I had a younger brother, Thomas. He died in a car accident when I was 15 and he was 12. My family never talks about him. They pretend he never existed because grief is messy and uncomfortable and doesn't fit into the perfect image they've spent decades constructing." The pain in his voice was subtle but unmistakable, and Natalie felt her heart clench. "I'm so sorry," she said softly. "Don't be," Jonathan replied, his voice hardening again. "It was a long time ago. I'm only telling you so you don't accidentally mention having siblings or ask about childhood memories." In the West family version of history, there were only ever 3 children. The driveway seemed to stretch forever, a perfect ribbon of pavement cutting through a landscape of ancient oak trees heavy with snow. And then the house came into view, and Natalie's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't a home. It was a monument to wealth and power. The West Estate was a sprawling Georgian mansion of red brick and white columns, perfectly symmetrical, perfectly maintained, perfectly intimidating. It looked like something from a historical drama, all formal grandeur and cold elegance. Every window glowed with warm light, but somehow the effect wasn't welcoming. It felt like a stage set, beautiful and utterly hollow. "Last chance to change your mind," Jonathan said as he parked the car in the circular drive. "We can turn around right now. I'll still honor the payment. You saved me from having to face this alone, even if it's just by driving here with me." Natalie looked at him, really looked at him, and saw past the expensive clothes and perfect hair to the man underneath. He was terrified. Not of his family, exactly, but of something deeper. Of being seen, perhaps. Of being judged and found wanting by the people who were supposed to love him unconditionally. "I signed a contract," Natalie said, reaching for the door handle. "And I keep my promises." Before Jonathan could respond, the massive front door of the mansion swung open, and a woman emerged. Victoria West was everything Natalie had imagined and more. She wore a cream silk dress that draped perfectly over her slender frame, her silver hair styled in an elegant twist, pearls at her throat and ears. Her posture was ramrod straight, her movements fluid and practiced. She looked like she had stepped out of a magazine spread about gracious holiday entertaining, but it was her smile that made Natalie's stomach drop. It was perfect, practiced, and didn't reach her eyes at all. "Jonathan," Victoria called out, her voice carrying across the snow with crystalline clarity. "You're late." We were beginning to worry. Jonathan got out of the car and moved to Natalie's side with surprising speed. He opened her door and offered his hand, and when she took it, he pulled her close, his arm sliding around her waist in a gesture that looked practiced but felt strangely natural. The warmth of his palm seeped through the fabric of her coat. "A small point of heat in the chilling atmosphere, Mother," he said, his voice taking on a formal tone Natalie hadn't heard before, something polished and distant. "I'd like you to meet Natalie." "My wife." Victoria's smile froze for just a fraction of a second, a crack in her perfect facade, a flash of something cold in her eyes. Then the smile widened, and she descended the steps with arms outstretched. "Natalie, what a wonderful surprise. Jonathan has been terribly secretive about you." "We were beginning to think you were imaginary," Victoria said, pulling Natalie into an embrace that was brief and cold, like being hugged by a beautiful statue, up close. Natalie could see the calculation in the older woman's eyes, the way she assessed everything from Natalie's coat to her boots to the ring on her finger. Taking inventory, looking for flaws. "Come inside," Victoria commanded, already turning back toward the house. "Everyone is eager to meet the mysterious woman who finally caught my son's attention." The interior of the West Estate was even more intimidating than the exterior. The foyer alone was larger than Natalie's entire apartment, with soaring ceilings decorated with elaborate plasterwork, a crystal chandelier that looked like it belonged in a palace, and a grand staircase that split into directions like the arms of a welcoming ghost. Holiday decorations were everywhere, but they were all coordinated in whites and silvers and golds, professionally arranged, devoid of any warmth or personal touch. It looked like a department store display, perfect and sterile. The family was gathered in what Victoria called the drawing room, and Natalie felt like she was entering a courtroom. Richard West sat in a leather wingback chair positioned like a throne, his silver hair and sharp features giving him the appearance of an aging monarch. Cameron stood by an enormous fireplace with his wife, a thin blonde woman whose smile was tight and rehearsed. Two children played quietly on an expensive rug, so well-behaved they barely seemed real. And then there was Olivia. Jonathan's sister was beautiful in a dangerous way, all sharp cheekbones and calculating green eyes. She sat on a white silk sofa, one leg crossed elegantly over the other, holding a champagne flute like it was a weapon. When her gaze landed on Natalie, it felt like being examined under a microscope. "So," Victoria said, settling into her seat like a queen holding court, "tell us everything, Natalie. How did you and Jonathan meet? Why did we know nothing about this relationship?" And most importantly, why such a rushed, secretive marriage? The interrogation had begun. Natalie felt Jonathan's hand find hers under the table, his fingers interlocking with hers in what looked like affection but felt like a lifeline. She took a breath and launched into their rehearsed story, each word carefully measured. "We met at the Children's Literacy Charity Gala last spring," she said, pleased that her voice remained steady despite her racing heart. "I was there representing the accounting department's volunteer committee. Jonathan was giving the keynote speech about corporate social responsibility. We started talking during the reception, and honestly, I had no idea he was the CEO at first. He was just this incredibly intelligent, passionate man who genuinely cared about making a difference in children's lives." She glanced at Jonathan and found him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. She continued, warming to the story now. "We kept our relationship private because Jonathan values clear boundaries between personal and professional life. We didn't want office gossip or politics to complicate what we were building together. The marriage was impulsive, I suppose. We were in Vermont for a long weekend, and one evening we were watching the sunset from our cabin's porch, and Jonathan just asked. No elaborate production, no grand gesture. Just two people who knew they wanted to spend their lives together. It was a good story, Natalie thought. Believable, romantic without being saccharine, hitting all the right notes." But Olivia's eyes narrowed, and Natalie felt a chill run down her spine. "How wonderfully convenient," Olivia said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. She took a delicate sip of her champagne. "A whirlwind romance that no one knew about. A secret marriage with no witnesses we can verify. Tell me, Natalie, what do you love most about my brother? What is it about Jonathan that made you want to marry him so impulsively?" The question was a trap designed to expose any hesitation or falsehood, to catch her in a lie. The room fell silent, everyone watching, waiting. Natalie felt the weight of their scrutiny, saw the skepticism in their eyes, but as she looked at Jonathan, sitting rigid beside her with his jaw clenched and his eyes guarded, she found herself speaking a truth she hadn't expected, hadn't rehearsed, hadn't even fully realized until the words left her mouth. "He listens," she said softly, her voice carrying in the silent room. "In a world where everyone talks over each other, where everyone is more interested in being heard than actually hearing, Jonathan listens. He pays attention to the details other people miss. He remembers the small things that matter. When he looks at you, really looks at you, you feel seen in a way that's rare and precious." Something shifted in Jonathan's expression. His grip on her hand tightened almost painfully. And when he turned to look at her, she saw genuine surprise in his eyes, as if she had revealed something about him that even he hadn't recognized. "That's quite poetic," Richard West said, his voice dry and analytical. "Now tell me about your family background, Natalie. Your education, your career ambitions." The afternoon crawled by with endless questions, each one designed to probe and test and find the weak spots in their story. Richard questioned her pedigree, her qualifications, her financial status. Cameron made subtle digs about her youth and inexperience, about whether she truly understood what it meant to be a West. Victoria critiqued everything from her clothing choices to her posture to the way she held her teacup. But through it all, Jonathan never left her side. His hand remained on her back, her shoulder, her hand a constant anchor. He deflected the cruelest questions with smooth redirection, challenged assumptions with quiet authority, and presented a united front that was almost convincing enough to fool even Natalie. When Victoria finally announced it was time to show them to their room, Natalie felt a wave of relief so profound she almost sagged with it. But that relief died the instant they reached the second floor and Victoria opened the door to what she called the master guest suite. "I've prepared our finest room for you newlyweds," Victoria said with a smile that held a distinct edge of challenge. "I trust you'll find it comfortable. Dinner is at 7 sharp. Don't be late." The door closed with a soft click, and Natalie and Jonathan stood frozen, staring into the room. There was one bed. One massive, 4-poster bed draped in white linens and piled with decorative pillows that probably cost more than Natalie's monthly salary. The implications were unavoidable, inescapable. "I'll take the couch," Jonathan said immediately, his voice flat. He didn't look at her, already moving to shrug off his jacket. The leather sofa near the window looked elegant but deeply uncomfortable for someone of his height. They moved around the space with careful, awkward choreography, unpacking their bags with exaggerated politeness, each hyper-aware of the other's presence. When their eyes accidentally met, they both looked away quickly, the air between them crackling with an uncomfortable tension that neither wanted to acknowledge. Natalie retreated to the marble bathroom to change, and when she emerged in simple cotton pajamas, Jonathan was already settled on the sofa with his back to the room. A single throw blanket pulled over his shoulders that clearly wasn't adequate for sleeping. She climbed into the enormous bed, the sheets cool and expensive against her skin, and lay stiffly in the center, staring at the ceiling. She listened to Jonathan's breathing from across the room, a strange and unsettlingly intimate sound in the darkness. They were strangers sharing a space, bound by a contract and a lie, and yet somehow it felt more real than anything else in this house of carefully constructed facades. Hours passed. The house settled into its nighttime rhythms, pipes creaking, wind whistling against windows. Natalie drifted in and out of restless half-sleep, her mind spinning with the events of the day, the weight of the ring on her finger, the echo of Jonathan's hand in hers. She was pulled from a light doze by a sound. A low, distressed murmur from the direction of the couch. Then a sharper gasp. Choked and broken, Natalie sat up, her eyes adjusting to the darkness. She could see Jonathan's silhouette, and he wasn't lying still anymore. His body was tense, contorted, tangled in the inadequate blanket. His breathing was rapid and uneven. "No," he muttered, his voice thick with sleep and anguish. "Please, Thomas, no. I'm sorry. I should have been there." The words were raw, unguarded, a glimpse into a private hell. Natalie knew she should stay in bed, should respect his privacy, should maintain the professional distance their contract demanded. But she found herself crossing the room anyway, her bare feet silent on the plush carpet. Up close, she could see his face contorted in distress, could see the way his hands clenched into fists, could hear the broken whispers of guilt and grief. "Jonathan," she said softly, kneeling beside the couch. She hesitated for just a moment before gently touching his shoulder. "Jonathan, wake up. You're dreaming." He jolted awake with a sharp, ragged gasp, his eyes flying open. For a terrifying moment, he stared at her without recognition, still trapped between nightmare and reality. His chest heaved, his eyes were wild, and she could see him struggling to orient himself, to remember where he was. Then awareness flooded back, and with it came a vulnerability so raw it made her chest ache. The powerful CEO was gone. The carefully controlled businessman had vanished. In his place was just a man, haunted by old ghosts and unbearable guilt. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice hoarse and broken. "I didn't mean to wake you." "You didn't," Natalie lied gently. "I couldn't sleep." They stared at each other in the darkness, lit only by the faint moonlight filtering through the curtains. Something unspoken passed between them. A recognition of shared pain, of parallel scars, of two people who had learned to survive alone, suddenly finding themselves less alone. "My brother," Jonathan said suddenly, the words spelling out as if he had no control over them. "Thomas, he died when I was 15. Car accident. I was supposed to go with him that night to a friend's party, but I stayed home to study for an exam. I thought I was being responsible, making the right choice. But if I had gone, if I had been there, maybe I could have stopped him from getting in the car. Maybe I could have convinced him to wait, to call our parents, to do something different." His voice cracked on the last word, and Natalie saw the shine of tears in his eyes. "I dream about it sometimes. I'm there watching it happen, and I tried to stop it. But I can't move, can't speak, can't do anything but watch him die over and over again." The confession hung in the air between them, a gift of trust that Natalie hadn't expected and hadn't earned. But she understood it. She understood the weight of survivor's guilt, the what-ifs that haunted the space between sleeping and waking. The crushing burden of believing you could have changed everything if only you had made one different choice. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, and meant it with every fiber of her being. "That's not your fault, Jonathan. You were a child. You made a normal choice. You can't carry that guilt, can't I?" he asked, a bitter smile twisting his lips. "My family certainly thinks I should. My mother, she looked at me the day after the funeral and said, 'Why couldn't it have been you instead?' She didn't mean it, probably. She was grieving, not thinking clearly. But I've never forgotten those words. And every year at Christmas, every family gathering, I see it in their eyes. The question, why are you here when Thomas isn't?" Natalie's heart shattered for him. She understood now the contract, the rule about not developing feelings, the walls he had built around his heart. It wasn't about protecting himself from her. It was about protecting himself from ever caring about anyone enough to experience that kind of devastating loss again. "The contract," Jonathan said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. "The rule about not developing feelings. It wasn't just about keeping our arrangement professional. After Thomas died, I learned that caring deeply about people, letting them into your heart, it only leads to unbearable pain. I built walls because walls don't crack under pressure. They don't abandon you. They don't die and leave you drowning in guilt and grief." He sat up, running both hands through his disheveled hair. And in the dim light, he looked younger, more human, stripped of all his corporate armor. "I know it's not healthy. I know it's not normal. But it's kept me safe for 15 years. It's let me function, succeed, build a life that doesn't involve the constant terror of losing someone I care about." Natalie understood then, truly understood, what she was dealing with. This wasn't just a business arrangement or a family deception. This was a man so damaged by loss that he had built his entire life around the principle of never letting anyone close enough to hurt him again. "Thank you for waking me," Jonathan said, his voice steadier now. "And thank you for not judging me. Everyone has pain they carry," Natalie said softly. "Everyone has nights when the ghosts come calling. You don't owe me explanations or apologies." She stood to return to the bed, but Jonathan caught her hand, his fingers warm and solid around hers. The touch sent electricity racing through her. A jolt of awareness that had nothing to do with their contract and everything to do with the man himself. "Natalie," he said. And her name on his lips sounded different than it ever had before. Weighted with something she couldn't name. "What you said downstairs, about me listening. Did you mean that? Or was it just a good answer to deflect Olivia's question?" She could lie. She should lie. But in the darkness, with his defenses down and hers crumbling, honesty felt like the only option that made sense. "I meant every word," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You do listen. You do see people. That's not part of the performance, Jonathan. That's who you are when you let yourself be." His grip on her hand tightened, and for a long moment, they just stayed like that, connected in the darkness. Then he slowly released her, and she returned to the bed, but sleep felt impossible now. Something fundamental had shifted between them, something the contract hadn't accounted for, something that felt both dangerous and inevitable. Christmas morning at the West Estate was a perfectly orchestrated performance devoid of genuine joy. The family gathered in the formal living room where a massive tree stood decorated in coordinated silver and white, surrounded by precisely wrapped gifts that looked more like props than presents. The gift exchange was mechanical, transactional. Richard received luxury items he would never use. Victoria accepted jewelry with practiced gratitude. Cameron's children opened expensive educational toys with subdued politeness that seemed unnatural for kids their age. Every smile was measured, every thank you rehearsed. When it came time for Natalie and Jonathan, Victoria presented them with matching monogrammed luggage. And the message was clear: "You're temporary. You won't be staying long. You'll be leaving soon." Natalie felt her chest tighten with familiar pain. She had nothing for Jonathan, hadn't even thought to bring a gift for this performance. But then Jonathan stood and left the room without explanation, He returned moments later with a small package wrapped in simple brown paper, so different from the elaborate presentations of the other gifts. He handed it to Natalie, and his eyes held something soft, something vulnerable. "I know we agreed not to exchange gifts," he said quietly, "but I saw this and thought of you." With trembling hands, Natalie unwrapped the package. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its pages thick and cream-colored, perfect for writing or sketching. But it was the inscription on the first page that made tears prick her eyes. "For the stories you haven't told yet, and the dreams you haven't dared to dream. You deserve both." It was thoughtful, personal, and had nothing to do with their arrangement. It was a gift that saw her as a person, not a prop. It acknowledged the things she had mentioned in passing during their long hours at the office, her love of writing, her childhood dream of being an author, the journal she had kept as a child moving between foster homes. "Thank you," she whispered, clutching the journal to her chest. "This is the most thoughtful gift anyone has ever given me." The afternoon brought some reprieve from the oppressive atmosphere when Jonathan suggested a walk on the estate grounds. The snow had stopped, leaving the world covered in pristine white. They bundled into coats and stepped into the crisp winter air, their breath forming clouds between them. Here, away from his family's scrutiny, Jonathan relaxed. He pointed out places from his childhood: the oak tree he used to climb with Thomas, the frozen pond where they learned to skate, the small stone bridge where he used to hide with books when the house felt too stifling. "I haven't talked about him this much in years," Jonathan admitted as they stood by the pond. "My family, we all just pretend he never existed. It's easier than dealing with the grief, they think. But sometimes I wonder if forgetting someone is worse than remembering the pain of losing them. Remembering keeps them alive in a way," Natalie said gently. "The pain is the price we pay for love. If it didn't hurt, it would mean they didn't matter." Jonathan looked at her with something like wonder. "How did you get so wise?" "Foster care teaches you things," Natalie replied. "You learn early that everyone you love will eventually leave. And you have two choices: stop loving people, or love them anyway and accept that the pain is worth it." They walked in comfortable silence, and Natalie found herself sharing pieces of her own story. The mother who had abandoned her at 3. The father she had found years later, sick and alone, who had become her world. The constant moving, the temporary homes. The learned skill of making herself small and unobtrusive so people wouldn't mind keeping her a little longer. "You've spent your whole life taking care of other people," Jonathan observed. "Who takes care of you?" The question hit her like a physical blow because no one had ever asked it before. "I manage," she said, but her voice wavered. "That's not what I asked." They were standing very close now, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his brown eyes, close enough that his breath warmed her cold cheeks. The moment stretched, heavy with unspoken things, and then Jonathan stepped back abruptly. "We should get back," he said, his voice suddenly formal. "Dinner will be soon." But as they walked back to the house, Natalie felt the truth settling over her like fresh snow. She was falling for him. Despite the contract, despite the rules, despite every logical reason she had to protect her heart, she was falling for Jonathan West, and she didn't know how to stop. That evening brought the West family's annual Christmas party, a massive affair with hundreds of guests filling the mansion. Natalie wore a midnight blue dress that Jonathan had insisted on buying her, and even she had to admit she looked transformed, more elegant, more like she belonged in this glittering world. Jonathan stayed close to her all evening, introducing her to business associates and family friends, his hand a constant presence on her back. To anyone watching, they looked like a couple deeply in love. And the terrifying thing was, it wasn't entirely an act anymore. The touches came naturally now. When he leaned down to whisper something in her ear, when she straightened his tie, when their eyes met across the crowded room, it all felt heartbreakingly real. They were standing near an enormous fireplace, taking a brief respite from socializing, sharing a quiet laugh about a particularly pompous guest, when Olivia appeared with a triumphant smile. In her hand, she held a small sprig of mistletoe, and before either of them could react, she dangled it directly above their heads with theatrical flair. Well, Olivia announced loudly, her voice carrying across the room and drawing the attention of dozens of guests. Looks like tradition demands a kiss from our secretive newlyweds. You can't refuse Christmas tradition, can you? The crowd around them grew quiet, expectant, curious. It was a test, a trap, a public examination of their authenticity. Cameras appeared, phones lifted to capture the moment. Natalie's heart hammered against her ribs so hard she thought everyone must be able to hear it. They could refuse, make a joke, laugh it off. But that would only fuel the suspicion she saw in many eyes, the doubt that had lingered throughout the evening. Jonathan turned to face her fully, and something passed between them. A silent conversation in the space of a heartbeat. His hand came up slowly, cupping her cheek with a tenderness that made her knees weak. His thumb brushed her skin in a gesture so gentle it brought tears to her eyes. "Is this okay?" he whispered, so quietly only she could hear. She nodded, not trusting her voice, and gave him permission for something that felt like so much more than just a performance. And then he kissed her. It started as what it was supposed to be, a soft, chaste press of lips for the benefit of their audience, appropriate and controlled. But the moment their lips touched, something ignited between them like a match struck in darkness. The kiss deepened, became something neither of them had planned or expected or could control. His hand slid into her hair, and she found herself gripping his jacket, pulling him closer, desperate and aching. The performance shattered into truth. This wasn't acting. This wasn't pretending. This was months of unacknowledged tension, days of growing connection, and a desperate, terrifying recognition of something real blooming between them. The room, the guests, Olivia's triumphant smile, the cameras, it all disappeared. There was only the heat of his mouth, the strength of his arms around her, the dizzying, terrifying realization that she had fallen completely, irrevocably in love with him. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, the room erupted in applause and appreciative murmurs. But Natalie barely heard any of it. She was staring into Jonathan's eyes, seeing her own shock and fear and desperate hope reflected back at her. They had just broken the cardinal rule, and they both knew it. Without a word, Jonathan took her hand and led her from the ballroom, through quiet hallways, to the sanctuary of the library. He closed the heavy doors behind them, and the silence that fell was deafening. He moved to the fireplace, bracing his hands on the mantel, his shoulders rigid with tension. "That shouldn't have happened," he said, his voice rough and strained. "We broke the rule," Natalie whispered, her own voice shaking. The reality crashed over her like ice water. The contract, the confession clause, the termination of their agreement, the loss of the remaining money, the transfer to Chicago, the end. "The contract is clear," she continued, forcing herself to speak the truth they were both avoiding. "We have to end this now. We have to confess, and it's over." The words felt like a death sentence for something that had only just begun to live. The thought of leaving, of never seeing him again except as a distant memory, of returning to her life and pretending this had never happened, it was physical pain. A sharp twisting ache in her chest that made it hard to breathe. "I don't want to," Jonathan said suddenly, turning to face her. The confession ripped from him, raw and desperate. "I don't want this to end, Natalie. I don't want you to go." His words shattered the last of her composure. "I don't want to go," she admitted, tears streaming down her face. "I don't want this to be over." They stared at each other across the space, caught in an impossible situation of their own making. The contract that had brought them together now demanded their separation, just as they had finally, irrevocably, found each other. Jonathan closed the distance between them in 3 strides. He stopped inches from her, not touching but close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him. "We have one more day," he said, his voice low and pleading. "Tomorrow, Boxing Day, the agreement isn't officially over until the morning after. Let's pretend for one more day. Not for my family, for us." Let's pretend this is real, just until we have to leave. It was foolish, reckless, a postponement of inevitable heartbreak. But as she looked into his eyes and saw the same desperate need she felt, Natalie found herself nodding. One more day, she agreed. Their final day at the West Estate was exquisite torture. They had agreed to pretend it was real, and without the weight of performance, without the shield of their arrangement, everything felt heightened precious, painted in colors that were almost too bright to bear. They spent the morning together in the library, talking about everything and nothing. Jonathan told her about his dreams of leaving the company, of starting something smaller and more meaningful, of building something with his own hands rather than inheriting someone else's empire. Natalie told him about the novel she had always wanted to write, the stories that lived in her head, the life she had imagined before circumstances forced her into practicality. They walked through the snow-covered gardens, holding hands not because anyone was watching, but because they wanted to. They stole kisses in hidden corners, shared laughter that was genuine and unguarded, and created memories that would have to last a lifetime compressed into hours. The family noticed the change. Even through their cynicism and carefully cultivated distance, they couldn't miss the authenticity of what had blossomed between Natalie and Jonathan. Richard engaged Natalie in a surprisingly pleasant conversation about literature. Cameron's barbs lost their edge. Even Victoria softened, pulling Natalie aside before dinner. "He's different with you," Victoria said quietly, and for once her smile reached her eyes. "I haven't seen him this happy since before we lost Thomas. Whatever you're doing, it's good for him." The irony was crushing. They had sold the lie so perfectly that it had convinced everyone, including themselves. And now it was too late. That evening, after the family had retired to bed, Natalie and Jonathan sat on the balcony of their room wrapped in blankets, watching snow begin to fall again. The world was silent and perfect, and Natalie wanted to stop time to freeze this moment forever. "What happens tomorrow?" she asked quietly. "Tomorrow we go back to reality," Jonathan said, but his voice was hollow. "You go to Chicago. I stay in New York. We fulfill the terms of our contract, and we never see each other again." That was the agreement. They sat in silence, and then Natalie felt her phone buzz. It was a text from her father. "They started the treatment today. The doctors are optimistic. I don't know how you did this, sweetheart, but you saved my life. I love you." She showed Jonathan the text, tears streaming down her face. "This is why I agreed," she said. "This is what the money bought. His life. How can I regret that?" "You shouldn't," Jonathan said, pulling her close. "You did what you had to do." "We both did." But as they sat there, holding each other as snow fell around them, they both knew that what they felt was worth more than any amount of money. And they were about to lose it because of a rule designed to protect hearts that were already irretrievably broken. The drive back to the city the next morning was silent. The farewell at the mansion had been warm Victoria kiss.